If you have your Bibles with you, please open up to Romans chapter 12. That's where we're going to be here this morning. That's where we're going to park it. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., John F. Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, Pearl Harbor, the invasion of Vietnam, 9/11, the earthquake in Haiti, Hurricane Harvey, Hurricane Katrina, the invasion of Iraq. All of these people or these events, for just about everyone in here, has impacted us in some way, shape, or form. Mostly, it has been a sense of shock, a sense of awe, maybe even a sense of wonder at how is it that something like this can happen to this person or that group of people or even our own country. And in each one of these situations, as history will show and history has shown, not only has circumstances and situations surrounding these events impacted people in their heart, in their mind, it has also caused people to be influenced to action. And maybe you weren't specifically there when that event happened, but each one of us, in a very real way, can understand that in life and in our own families, in our own communities, there are certain things, certain situations and circumstances that shake us to the core. And regardless of maybe even the moment, and maybe even without thinking about it, we just have a tendency to act. And so as we look at Romans chapter 12, the vast majority of us sitting here this morning have been impacted by one single event in history. The event in which God showed up on this earth, walked among people, displayed his power, his grace, his mercy, and called people to himself. And for it, he died. Yet before he died, he uttered a phrase which resonates with everybody here, which resonates with billions of people across the world. And that phrase is this: it is finished. And to a large degree, for those billions of people, it not only impacted their heart, it not only impacted their mind, it caused us to act. It caused us for a time in our life to realize exactly who we were and exactly what we needed and exactly who offered this ultimate gift called salvation. But a funny thing happens in situations like the assassinations that I've mentioned, things like Pearl Harbor, things like 9/11, things like the earthquake in Haiti, things like Hurricane Harvey. Let me ask you a question. How often do you dwell on those things outside of the time in which it's time to remember and commemorate those events? See, one of the things that Americans are known for around the world is that we are very quick to forget history. And when you forget history, you're doomed to repeat it. And that can even translate to our spiritual life. For as we all look back and we survey and we think about the moment in which we were saved from our sins and the moment in which we were actually saved from ourself, the euphoria and the joy, if we're not careful, can be like commemorating Pearl Harbor, in which the date comes and it just slips our mind. It no longer resonates with the core of who we are. It no longer resonates in the actions that move people to remember or move people to continuously give to a relief effort for some tragedy that took place years and years ago. And if we're not careful, spiritually what can take place is we can forget who we are. And we can stop using the gifts that God has given us naturally. And so in Romans chapter 12, what we see here is Paul has finished from chapter 1 to 11. Paul has finished what we call the doctrinal portion of Romans. He has laid out the case for the gospel. He has laid out the case that the gospel has the power to save and impact everybody. Because in Romans chapter 3, he notes that God's grace and mercy has been manifest because all have fallen short and all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And he's working with these groups of people these two groups of people who have accepted that message, but have not accepted or have forgotten their role. See, it's one thing to be momentarily impacted and moved. It's a completely different thing to allow that momentary impact, that momentary feeling, that momentary commitment to resonate and be a part and be established and be a sustaining aspect of somebody's life day in and day out. And so what Paul does in Romans chapter 12, he gives them the so. And now he gives them the so what? From chapter 12 all the way to the end of the book. And in Romans chapter 12, this is so important for you and for I. In Romans chapter 12, from verse 1 all the way to verse 8, and really throughout the rest of the chapter, Paul says this, is that the gospel impacts the heart and the head, but should also influence our actions. That the gospel impacts the heart and the head, but should influence our actions. And note what he says in verse 1 in chapter 12. He says there, I appeal to you therefore, on the basis of everything that I have talked about from chapter 1 all the way through chapter 11, right to this moment, on the basis of the fact that everybody has fallen short of the glory of God, on the basis of the fact that the gospel has the power to save both Jew and Gentile, on the basis of the fact that Christ, that God's grace and mercy has been manifest in Jesus Christ, I appeal by the mercies of God to present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual act of service. And so he says, as the gospel impacts your heart and as the gospel impacts your head, there should be something completely and totally different about your life. That no longer do we live to ourselves. No longer do we live for the passions of what we want. No longer do we live for the passions of giving ourselves a pat on the back or seeking the approval of the people around us. That because of the gospel, because it's impacted our heart, because it's impacted our head, that there's something different about what we do with our bodies, with our lives. That we are presented to God as a set apart people. Just saw a survey the other day done by the Barna Group. I have to admit, I shed some tears. Generation Z, those born between 2000 and 2015, are 2 times as likely to be non-believers than by comparison to the rest of the population. And the question that we have to ask when we look at something like that stat is, why? Why is that the case? And this isn't just talking about general population. This is also, it takes into account young people growing up in the church. And so the question is, how is that possible? Could it be that maybe what they've seen modeled are people who want all the fixins of the world and all the fixins of the gospel? And so they see this uneven balance between their grandparents and parents and maybe even some leaders in the church, maybe even the preacher. And so what they say is on the net level, there's nothing categorically different about the lives that I see in the people who are closest to me and the lives of the people who I see that are worldly. There's nothing ultimately really different between the Christian and the one who is in the world. See, here's the point. If we are going to be people of the book, if we're going to be people who, this is an analogy, who have tattooed Jesus Christ on our hearts and walk around and tell people we are Christians, then there's no way in which I can feast on the desires of the world and still maintain my set apartness that's seen in being a follower of Jesus Christ. And that's why he gives the second appeal, is that do not conform to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good, acceptable, and perfect. See, in this section, he appeals to the mercies of God and then begs both the Jew and the Gentile not to become like the world. See, it's impacted your head, it's impacted your heart. So why then would we look like that which we at one point in time promised ourselves and promised God that we would never go back to, that we would never be consistently living for that which we have stated that we would ultimately deny? And so the gospel, if the gospel has the power to save, then it impacts both the head and the heart. And that in my thinking, I no longer see the world through worldly lenses. I see the world through heavenly lenses. I no longer ask myself, what do I think is the best situation or best way to handle this situation? The first appeal I go to is, okay, in this situation in which I'm dealing with an enemy, or in this situation in which I'm dealing with family, or in this situation in which I'm dealing with an opponent of the gospel. It's not, what do I think? It's, hey, how did Christ interact with these people? Because I've been influenced. Because I've been impacted. That following Jesus Christ is more than just wearing a bracelet or a t-shirt to Bible camp. That it's more than just getting a spiritual high because I go to some place for a weekend and they make me feel good about myself. Not that that's bad, but that can't be it. And here's one we might have a conversation about, and I might get some emails about. It can't just be because I sat in a pew on Sunday. It can't just be that. It has to be more than that. That what I learn from that camp, or what I learn from that weekend, or what I gain in the fellowship and the exchanging of the Bible with my brothers and sisters on a Sunday, it can't just be hearing, listening, walking out and doing nothing. It has to be hearing, listening, digesting, meditating, going back and re-looking and re-examining and re-studying, so that when I do leave or when I do interact, that there is something distinctly different about my life. And what so many people in the world claim to see from Christians is that they see something that doesn't look like Jesus. You hear this thing, this phrase, and it peeves me to a little bit, because we hear this thing called, "You're the only Jesus that some people might see." What? No. Jesus is the only Jesus that people are going to see. Because if I'm the only Jesus that people see, you know what they're going to see from about the age of 15 to 21? You know what they saw? They saw a guy that was mad because he was abandoned by parents. And so if I'm the only Jesus that people see from 15 to 21, then what do people think about Jesus? Jesus doesn't like parents. No. It's I'm a beggar that has found the bread of the gospel, and I want people to feast on the bread of the gospel, not on me. But I want them to know where I got the bread from, and that this bread tastes so good that it's changed my life. Let me ask you a very serious question this morning. Why are you here? Why are you here? Are we here this morning because mom and dad drug us out of bed? Are we here this morning because that's just what we do? Or are we here this morning because we have an insatiable appetite to get closer to God and look more like Christ? Are we here this morning so that we might be further transformed? Or are we simply conforming to the church culture that's been in America for 70 years? There is a distinct difference between those two things. I don't want to be religious. I want to be Christian. I don't want to be a law keeper. I want to be a follower. I don't want to worry about the Super Bowl on Sunday. I want to live like Christ on Monday through Saturday. But the only way that that can happen is if Jesus has transformed and impacted my life. To where when the opportunity presents itself, no, not the opportunity that presents itself, but that I go looking for the opportunity to tell people about Christ, because he has impacted my heart and mind, and it has moved me to action. And so Paul goes on and he says, if you're conforming to the world, don't do that, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And then he says, he goes into specifics about how this gospel is supposed to impact our actions. Note what it says in verse 3. For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, do not think of himself more highly than he ought to think. Number one, because the gospel has impacted my heart and impacted my mind in action, in my own thought process, in the way in which I carry myself, I don't think of myself more than I am. And what does the gospel, what does the essence of the gospel require me to think about myself? In order for someone to obey the gospel and understand the weight of the gospel, they first have to understand the weight of their sin. That before Christ, that before I even knew about God, there's this great chasm between me and Jesus. And no matter how hard I tried, no matter how hard I worked, no matter how fast I tried to swim or how high I tried to jump, I couldn't clear the hurdle. And Jesus doesn't just help me over the hurdle, he removes the hurdle so I can walk the straight and narrow. But in order to do that, I got to recognize exactly who at the core I am. And so he says in verse 4, "For as in one body we have many members, and the members do not all have the same function." And so what Paul is saying here is that every member of the body has a gift, has a purpose, has a function. I hope you know that this morning. I hope that encourages you this morning. I hope that that moves you to action this morning. That no matter how bad off you might think life is right now, or how worthless you may feel, or how inadequate you might think about yourself in the big scheme of the advancement of the kingdom, you have a function. You have a place. You have a purpose. And that purpose has been designed for you from the foundation of the world by God himself. That he thought so much of you that he endowed you with certain gifts and certain abilities so that you can leverage those gifts and leverage those abilities so that the church, so that the kingdom might be spread and so that people might know Christ. And I know this is usually kind of what happens. Some people say, "Well, I'm not preaching every Sunday. I'm not teaching a Bible class. I've got, X problem. I can't really go on a door knocking campaign because of health issues." You know what? Still have a function. See, here's the thing that Paul's trying to say, is that everybody has a function, but let's face it, not everybody has the same skill set. Not everybody has the same gift. Not everybody has the same role or purpose in the body, and that's what's being talked about here. See, this is what happened with the Jews and the Gentiles. We see this even in 1 Corinthians, in which the Jews and the Gentiles, because they have this ought against each other, they can't lower themselves, number one, humble themselves, and they can't accept that this Jewish brother over here might be a better Bible teacher and have a better skill set for Bible teaching than this Gentile brother over here, because after all, that's a Jew, and Jews aren't supposed to be able to do that. That's not the purpose of the Jewish brother. The Jewish brother is supposed to sit at the feet of the Gentile brother. Or why in the world would this Gentile brother, be an elder in the church at Rome? He's a Gentile. Well, maybe he's a better leader than the Jewish brother. And what Paul is saying is, regardless of whether you have the skill set to be a Bible teacher, regardless of whether you have the skill set and qualification to be an elder, regardless of whether you're a better encourager of somebody, all of that stuff, ding, 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 matters. And all of us have something that we can leverage for the sake of the body. And here's the question that I want to ask us. If God has given me this natural skill set that I can use to leverage for the advancement of the gospel, and I fail to use that, or I say, I'm not going to use that, what am I saying to God about the natural gift that he's given me outside of Jesus Christ? Two gifts God has given every single Christian: the gospel and a skill set. And to not utilize your skill set for the advancement of the gospel is really to deny the overwhelming grace and mercy of the gift that God gave you in the gospel. And he says, hey, not all members have that skill set. Not all members have that same function. So though we are many, we are one body in Christ, and individually members one of another. Having gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, let us use them. And so the question might be, well, how do I know what my gift is? Let me ask you this question. And this is the easiest way to figure this out. What are you naturally good at? What are you naturally good at? Some of us are naturally good at teaching. Some of us are naturally good at interacting with people. Some of us are naturally good at keeping up with who's sick and who's in the hospital. Some of us are naturally good at typing. Some of us are naturally good, and I don't mean this in any way. Some of us are naturally good at making some food. Some of us aren't. I'm looking at the clock. I'm not saying any names. But what are you naturally good at? And take what you're naturally good at and leverage it towards the gospel. Figure out, sit down with a brother or sister who's good at maybe discernment, who's good at giving advice, who's good at giving sound gospel advice, and say, hey, I've got this skill set. How can I use this to leverage the advancement, the kingdom of God? Some of us are really good at encouraging people. Some of us are really good at listening. And all of those things are not only needed in the body, all of those things are wanted in the body. But the nexus for me leveraging all that stuff is that my life's been changed. Notice what Paul says at the end here. He says, hey, having gifts that differ from one another, let us use them. If prophecy, in proportion to our faith. If service, in our serving. In the one who teaches, in his teaching. In the one who exhorts, in his exhortation. In the one who contributes, in generosity. See, here's the thing. Some of us, because of where we are, have the ability to be more generous than other people. Not that nobody here is generous, but the amount of generosity that I can delve on brothers and sisters in a time of need might be different for me than it is for you. You might have a better capability to do that than I am. And Paul is saying, go ahead and be generous. Go ahead and do that. Because in giving, God's grace is seen. God's grace is delved out. The one who leads with zeal. The one who does acts of mercy with cheerfulness. And verse 9, really bad section break. Because this ties all of it together. Let love be genuine. The one who works behind the scenes and isn't, quote, in the spotlight. Let that work be done from agape. The one who takes the time and to sit down and listen to a brother or sister in need. Let that listening and let that encouraging and let that advice giving be sound gospel advice that's given, but also with the expectation that nothing else will be required. For the one who teaches, let it be done diligently and in accordance with the word. For the one who leads with the concern, not just for their own desires, but for what's best for the flock. Let it be done out of love. So a couple of questions before we end here. What would that look like for your family? If you leverage the skills and abilities that you have and displayed those skills out of reverence for God, but also out of the desire to see people saved. Would a generation that follows not see that? Not be impacted by that? Not have a desire to follow that model? Because they see their parents, their grandparents, their schoolmates display this insatiable desire to follow Jesus. And what would that look like for this family? If everybody here took what they were naturally good at and leveraged it for each other. Leveraged it for the community. And leveraged it because at the core of the reason for what they do, for what we do, is because there was an event in history that took place 2,000 years ago that changed the course of our lives, that took us from the shore side of condemnation and put us on the sea of salvation. You know what would happen? Our approach and our thought process would look completely and totally different. Not just of people in the world, but every other church in the community. And we wouldn't have to do elaborate, evangelism programs because people would simply naturally be drawn to this place, to these people, to our God, to the New Testament model of Christianity naturally, and it wouldn't be forced. I hope that's your desire this morning. And even before I can do that, even before I can desire that, I have to ask myself this question. Am I in a spiritual, relational rut with God that has stifled and stalled